Good evening. My name is Mark Stad. I'm a junior at Harvard College and the president of the Harvard College Democrats. On behalf of the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard College, and the Institute of Politics, it is my honor to welcome Press Secretary Joe Lockhart. This past summer, I had the opportunity to work at the White House. One thing that I learned was that the press secretary's job is fast-paced and very intense. Whether it is a world crisis or a White House resident moving to a New York suburb, the press secretary must always be ready to comment. Joe Lockhart joins the ranks of Mike McCurry, Larry Speaks, and Jim Brady in holding this illustrious position. A press secretary is the voice of the president. In assuming this role, Joe Lockhart kept Americans abreast of the crisis in Kosovo, tells Americans about various social reforms such as increasing the minimum wage or the expansion of the earned income tax credit, and successfully coaches the president in his vital and frequent interactions with the press. However, today we all have the very special privilege of listening to a very different side of Joe Lockhart. Rather than hearing the thoughts and views of President Clinton through Joe Lockhart, we have the opportunity to hear Mr. Lockhart's own thoughts and views. It is with great respect that I introduce our moderator, a man who's familiar to all Harvard students, David Gergen. Mr. Gergen has been an active participant in American national life. He has served at the White House as an advisor to 4 presidents: Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and most recently, President Clinton. Mr. Gergen is currently a professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School and often can be found offering his political expertise on either PBS or CNN. Without further ado, David Gergen.
Thank you, Mark, and it's a pleasure to have a Harvard undergraduate speaking to us here again today. Mark told you about what Joe Lockhart does. The question I'd like to pose is, how does a relatively young man of 39 become press secretary to the President of the United States? If you're Joe Lockhart, you do it the old-fashioned way, by earning it. Earning it through 19 years, literally half his life, working his way up through the ranks of politics and journalism, gaining the respect and admiration of his colleagues in both fields. It's a tale worth telling briefly tonight because some of you here want to become the next Joe Lockhart, and some of you are interested in knowing how the system works. Back in 1980, Joe Lockhart was an undergraduate at Georgetown University when he decided to take some time out. He volunteered for Jimmy Carter's re-election campaign very briefly, switched over to become a foot soldier for NBC at the Democratic National Convention, then switched back to become a paid member of the President Carter's re-election team during the 1980 campaign. At age 20, 2 patterns were already emerging in his life: a dexterity at moving back and forth from politics to the press, and a great deal of personal enterprise. To get his job on the Carter campaign, this young man of 20 knew he had to talk personally with the campaign press secretary, and the issue was, how do I get through to her? How do I get through to that bevy of aides outside? So he waited till all the bevy of aides went home, placed his call knowing the press secretary would answer the phone. He got the job. Campaign did not work, however, and he went back to private life, worked for a lieutenant governor, had a brief stint as a PR man with Al Newharth as he started up USA Today, completed his Georgetown degree, and then he was back to the next presidential campaign, working for the Mondale campaign in 1984. Maxine Isaacs is here. She remembers that campaign well, and I'm sure they worked together back in those days. Well, the doors kept revolving in his life. After Mondale lost, he worked briefly on the Hill for Senator Paul Simon, did a stint with ABC in Chicago, second network, and became an assignment editor for CNN in Washington, third network. He was really learning the ropes by now. But the siren song of another presidential campaign lured him back to Democratic politics in 1988, this time with the Dukakis campaign. Yet another Democrat went down in flames. 3 campaigns, 0 for 3, and Joe headed back to the private sector. Your head must be spinning by now. Think of him. His wife, Laura, whom he had met through Democratic politics, was a producer for ABC and was assigned to London. Joe quit a PR job in Washington to go with it. They stayed 6 years. Joe soon became a freelance producer for NBC, back to NBC, then worked for Sky News, the British channel. They were up to, how many are we up to now? Doing some on-the-air reporting before signing up with the London office of an American public relations firm. His pal Mike McCurry was working for the same firm back in Washington. By the time the Lockharts came home in 1995, Mike McCurry was press secretary to President Clinton, and he lured Joe into the biggest job that he had held so far. That was as press secretary for President Clinton's re-election campaign. This time, he won, and there is a huge difference in winning. He went to the White House. He won so much praise for his fierce, aggressive promotion of the president that when it was over, the president and McCurry agreed to bring in Joe as deputy press secretary at the White House. 2 years later, Mike McCurry was ready to move on, and his deputy was ready to move up, just in time to become the principal spokesman for the president during the impeachment fight on Capitol Hill. Mike McCurry, as all of you know, was an extremely hard act to follow. And many wondered whether Joe Lockhart could ever come into his own. But 16 months later, there's a growing consensus in Washington that he has not only met that challenge, but is carving out his own reputation as a savvy, hard-hitting, but principled press secretary for his president. Joe is known for his sharp tongue, especially in partisan matters. When he was McCurry's deputy, he fed him a famous retort when Republican Congressman Dan Burton called the president, quote, a scumbag. Came the reply from the White House, it's good to see the congressman has advanced to using two-syllable words. Joe is also known as someone who has easy access to his boss. On trips, they play a mean game of hearts with each other. But mostly, he is known today as a pro. He is the first White House press secretary in a quarter of a century who has worked seriously in the press before taking this job. He knows the rhythms and impulses of the press better than almost anyone else in Washington. To reporters, however, it is always clear that Joe Lockhart's first loyalty is to his boss. He is tireless in drawing attention to the president's dreams and accomplishments for the country. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming here the press secretary to the President of the United States, Joe Lockhart.
After listening to that litany of jobs, you probably think I'm not 39, but about 80. And after the last 16 months, I feel it. I want to thank Mark for his introduction. It's always great to hear, particularly from college Democrats. And I hope I do half as well as you did here. And I want to thank David for that very kind introduction. There's one thing that I want to fill David in that many of you probably don't know, but it takes a while when you work for the White House to complete one of the rituals. And I've finally done it after 4 years. I've now located and visited all the offices in the West Wing that David once worked in. On a more serious note, I have to say that I think as we get through this speech, you'll see that in many cases the political world of journalism isn't as good as it could be. And I personally have to say that I missed my favorite oasis in that vast wasteland by missing my Friday night appointments with Mr. Gergen and Mr. Shields, and maybe someday we can convince him to go back and do it again. I want to recognize a couple other people. Maxine Isaacs is here someplace. There she is. Maxine gave me my first real job in politics, working on the national level in 1983. And I think if any of you here are lucky enough to be her students and learn half as much as I did from her, you'll do just fine. Finally, thanks to Bill White, who's responsible for inviting me up here. Now, I see there's an awful lot of people here, and I kind of remember college, and it was a little bit of a mystery to me why on a Wednesday night you all would come out to listen to someone who basically gets paid to say nothing. But then on the way up here, I saw something on the bulletin board. It was the flyer which said, come see Joe Lockhart, free beer available, so I understand why you were all here. If you did actually see the real flyer, you'll see that there was some title for this speech. Let me just say, I turned in the title well before I started thinking about the speech, so I'm not even sure what it is. But I'd prefer to look at this speech as sort of the random musings of someone who dealt with the 9-day why peace talks, a military strike against Iraq, impeachment, and 3 speakers of the House before I'd finished my second month on the job. So it's slightly distorted, but here goes. One other note, actually, before I get into this. I understand that C-SPAN is broadcasting this event tonight, and I want to, because so much of politics is about playing the television, talk just a minute to the TV viewers. I think it's important to know, and without trying to inflate what I've learned over the years, but I have learned in 20 years of politics a few things about how to speak to the American people and how to get a message across. First thing you need to know is start slowly, get off to a sluggish start, thereby lowering expectations for your speech. And from the first couple minutes of this, I'm off to a good start. Secondly, opposition research is key. Understand the weaknesses of your competition. So I had a little look. I understand that I occupied the 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. time slot in C-SPAN tonight. And, but you can't judge this speech just by what's on. You have to judge by what else you have to watch. So I did a quick look this afternoon and found over on MSNBC, Headliners and Legends, The Life of Ed McMahon. Now on VH1, we've got Milli Vanilli, Behind the Music. Fox at 3 a.m. reruns one of my favorite shows, When Good Pets Go Bad, Part 3. And of course, on the more sophisticated sister network of C-SPAN 2, we have professional wrestling. I'm sorry, I misread that. That's this weekend's Reform Party convention. So for 3 a.m., this is about as good as you get. Now, turning back to everyone who's here in this room, I'll only make one promise. If all goes well and you're nice to me, we can all leave and go home and watch West Wing together. Let me say that it's a humbling experience to be invited here to Harvard to share my own unique or twisted perspective about what's going on in Washington. But then again, there are times every day when I get up at a podium that I am astounded that I've been offered this opportunity to occupy such a unique role in our American political system. Most days I feel like, a school crossing guard at the intersection of the federal government, the national media, and partisan politics. And they're all my children. It is, as I view it, a very exalted position. Think about it. I occupy the rarefied territory in the public's esteem, that very special place between disgust and disdain. Somewhere between how they view a traveling salesman and an internet hacker. Think of the labels: spinner, shill, flack, shaver of truth, parser of language, shader of fact. And that's just some of the accolades I got in this morning's mail. Of course, for the students here tonight, you know the feeling of what it's like to be viewed with some curiosity. Here you are, many of you, students of politics, believers in government, proponents of policy. Your parents must be so ashamed of you. I can just hear them now. Why couldn't you too be a .com dropout? All of your friends now who are out in the business world of .com are billionaires, but you just had to go to Harvard and throw it all away. Well, for what it's worth, and a rare moment of seriousness, I am proud to share a commitment to public service that I think most of you have. And I can't help confess with real pride, and however uncool it is in these days, to have played some small part, along with a great team at the White House, in the accomplishments of this administration over the last 7 years. But on a day like today, we had a press conference today. I hope everybody watched. It went very well. Nothing went wrong, I think. But on a day like today, when the president stands before the press, confident, cool, completely in control, you really have to wonder whether a president needs a press secretary at all. So, as I was watching the masterful performance, and my mind started to drift, because my mind generally starts to drift during a press conference because there's really nothing for me to do. By the time the president walks out, it's all up to him, and I can't help. I started thinking back on this proposition. And then, I had a little bit of a vision, which heartened me and made me feel that maybe I did have a future and press secretaries were necessary despite how well the president does. I thought about this, and we're going to have some audio-visual aids here, so I hope they work because I can't see them. But imagine this as a proposition. How would the world's most important figures, especially those famous for their bad press, have fared had they simply hired a good press secretary? Just think of how the headlines could have been different. This part of the speech, by the way, if you want to label it, I sort of think of it as sort of the press secretary's dream sequence. So it's kind of my. But let's start this. Let's start by going all the way back to Rome. And I have a paper here, which it's the right one. That's the right one. We all know that one of the tenets of press relations is you need a vigorous defense is the best offense. The same was true back in 44 BC. Here's this one. Brutus denies stabbing. Vows search for Caesar's real killers. I think we toss that. Now, many of us, particularly those of us who've had the pleasure of working in the private sector in public relations, know we have to resort to a tried and true technique. A soft feature story can really humanize, particularly a rough-edged subject. This one's Attila. He puts the fun in being a Hun. How could you not love him? Now, sometimes it's important to present cold facts in a warmer light. Tower of London, 1536. Henry VIII severs relationship with Anne Boleyn, but describes separation as swift but amicable. Okay. At other times, you just got to cast the facts aside and just spin and keep spinning. This one's from 1864. Sherman liberates Atlanta, citizen bonfires give city a joyous glow. Now, remember, in my business, perception is reality. Little Bighorn, 1866. Custer loses, but beats pundits' expectations. And finally, even the worst disasters I've found can be deflected as long as you have a good contingency plan. Liverpool, 1912, Titanic sinks. White Star Corporation blames vast iceberg conspiracy. Now, if only it was that easy, and if only those of us in this fraternity of press secretaries had that much power. But nowadays, everyone has a press secretary, but they face as a group a whole new set of challenges. After all, this is the time of news on demand, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's a far cry from a time where a handful of network executives and press room graybeards sat around in a secret society deciding exactly what news was. There were certainly shortcomings in that era, but those men and women, mostly men, did have the advantage of time to reflect, fewer pressures to entertain, and less incentive to rack up sales and ratings points. We do today have more voices, but too often those voices are shouting at each other. And when they're not shouting, they're writing politically incisive stories like Corinna Gore's Rebel Years, or they're breathlessly predicting the president won't last through the week. And I'm stuck most days in the equivalent of C-SPAN hell, denying or refusing to comment on the latest rumor. This is, and I think most people in the profession agree, hardly the golden age of political communication. And as far as the public is concerned, it's no surprise that their general view on politics and the press is a pox on both your houses. Now, I could spend the entire speech, in fact, the entire night, and would probably enjoy it, on discussing who's to blame or what's to blame. I could point a few fingers, take a few cheap shots at Chris Matthews and hardballs, but I think I'll save most of that good stuff for my book. What book? Anyway, but I'm not going to try to go through all of them, but what I want to do is go through a few problems that I think are systemic in the way politics works and the way the press works, and then hopefully offer an idea or two on how we might fix them. We live and work today in a society that's defined by exploding and exciting new technology. We also live in a new culture that dominates politics and journalism. And in many ways, that culture is defined by that technology. This mixture has left many of us who've worked in this business for a long time with a general feeling of dissatisfaction with the process and with an electorate that's clearly disaffected. Technology, from the internet to cable to the pager that I rely on for baseball scores, is making news more accessible. News has become now what internet people will call content. It's not news, it's not information, it's content. It's almost something that's fungible and tradable like a commodity. Just like stock quotes, digital music, online shopping, news or content is what happens in the world is accessible anytime, anywhere. It's inescapable. For that, we all should be mostly thankful. Technology is truly creating many more consumers for news. But technology and all that it's provided is also putting more pressure on the producers of that so-called content to turn out more news on more subjects faster than they've ever had to work before. That means more information, but it also means less time to check for accuracy, put something in context, or hold on to a story until you're sure you've gotten it straight. I think in this environment, more actually can be less if the hunger for news forces journalists and editors to cut corners on the basics of reporting and editing. Here's one example, one story of where I thought the technological tail was wagging the dog. In 1998, early in the Starr investigation, I got a call one afternoon from a major national newspaper. We don't have to name them. And they had a tip about something that had allegedly been said in the grand jury that was, quite interesting, and if true, would have been a good story for them. So I, did what I normally did. I took down all the questions, said I'd get back to them. About a half an hour later, I called back with the beginnings of an answer, which is often the case. And much to my surprise, the reporter said, well, I don't know how to tell you this, but we put that story up on the internet about a half an hour ago. And I said, you put it up before you even talked to me? And he said, well, I don't know. So I said, why? And I said, well, we were very afraid because of all the internet pages someone was going to beat us. And I said, that was more important than whether you had the story, and unfortunately in this case that was true. The bottom line is they got the story wrong. The testimony that they reported never happened. They later had to retract it, but from my purposes, it had already infected the media bloodstream. It's like when a judge or when a witness blurts something out in court and the judge says, now jurors, disregard that statement. It doesn't work that way. In the echo chamber of Washington, once something gets out, it becomes fact awfully quickly. But I think more importantly, this newspaper was forced to write a very interesting story and acknowledge that something they put on their webpage wasn't true, which created confusion. And I think confusion created problems of credibility, which as we moved through that very difficult year, I think many reporters and many editors struggled with. Now, if this new technology at times encourages bad behavior, I think the new culture of journalism in Washington rewards it. Say you're a young reporter. You go to Washington. There used to be a pretty simple path to success. Work hard, write straight stories about what's going on, and generally get it right most of the time. That's simple. Well, today, it seems to me that there are several options to getting ahead in Washington journalism. There's always option one, the old-fashioned way, earn it, as David said. But there's a second one now, and that's this one. Write a speculative story, not about what happened, but on what motivated it, and how politicians feel about this deep inside. And of course, throw in an obligatory quote from sources familiar with the president's thinking. And then there's a third, which is my personal favorite. Write a speculative story about how a politician feels, then book yourself on MSNBC to wonder aloud about the impact of those feelings on swing voters in the next elections. In a world where the McLaughlin Group defines our political discourse, and for some in journalism the pinnacle of success, it's no surprise that the last option is so popular. Now, just so you think I'm going to spend the next 2 hours going after the press, I'm now going to go after me. Of course, as much as they're speculating about us, we're spinning them. Now, putting a fine gloss on an unpleasant piece of news has long been a stock in trade for a press secretary. But not until recently, I don't think, were we so completely consumed with the fight for every news cycle, the fight to win every day's paper, every hour's broadcast, even every minute's update. And I think in that fight for the edge or the right spin, the truth sometimes suffers. And the art of politics becomes a zero-sum game defined by winners and losers without the nuance of facts that can often define a story. Now, for the most part, professional communicators don't come to work every day intent on deceiving the public and the press. But the system in which we work now, I believe, rewards things like speed and attitude. And those are at the expense of substance and perspective. It makes it hard in this system for many of us to resist the temptation of pushing the envelope of the truth. And I think, as many of us have learned, what sounds good on a Monday and what gets you through some mini problem on Monday can often by Wednesday be a real problem, and by the Sunday talk shows be a disaster. And what I mean by that is there's a temptation whenever a question comes in about something that's going on to provide an answer that whether you have the facts or not, has exculpatory information about your boss. And often you can make a fairly innocuous situation much worse by providing denials before you're able to, and before you have the facts to provide the denials. I think Boston reminds me of, for my part, I think where this all started, at least for me, and I know this went on for many, many years before I got involved, but I think for political operatives and press secretaries, on both sides of the aisle, 1988 was a defining year. That was the year Governor Dukakis ran for president, as unfortunately David told you was one of the many losing campaigns that I worked on. In large part, I think that campaign was undone because he didn't aggressively compete in what I call the trenches of the news cycle. He didn't, when a charge was made, he didn't necessarily feel that everything had to be fought back and everything, and it contributed greatly to a quite unsuccessful campaign. I believe now that those lessons actually may have been learned too well. In the daily and even hourly fighting, that system or ethos has evolved to such an extent that it has directly contributed to the decline of political discourse and increasingly the public's disconnection with the political system. So I think it's clear that there's not a bad guy and a good guy here. We have a system where I think the press needs to examine how they do their work, and we certainly, in the world of political communications, for lack of a better word, need to look at how we do our jobs. And it's not clear now how this will work out. The public is disaffected, is disconnected, but obviously that's a challenge that reigns before us. These are just, I think, examples or sort of systemic problems that are faced by reporters in the press. I think what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is actually talk a little bit about some of the things we can do and some of the things we can think about to help find possible solutions. And there's a tradition at the White House among press secretaries. I think it's supposed to be secret, but I'll tell you. When you go in and you start as a press secretary, and as you walk in the office, there's a closet there, and in that closet is appropriately a flak jacket, which I guess is supposed to provide some protection. I've yet to see any of it, and in the flak jacket is a note from each of the preceding press secretaries offering advice to whoever succeeded them. I've actually, as we wind down this year, started thinking about, well, what kind of advice could I offer to the person who replaces me? And I think what was interesting about thinking about the ideas about advice for the next White House press secretary, it struck me that almost every single one of these items applies equally to reporters and new reporters who come to Washington to cover the political process. So these are the ideas, and I'll just go through them quickly, and then we can get to the better part of doing questions, which is my normal stock and trade. This is, we'll call this Rule 1, and this sounds very obvious, but it actually, I think, is quite important, which is be a reporter, not a repeater. Now, that may be obvious to reporters, but surprisingly, this advice applies as much to press secretaries as it does to anyone who's a journalist. Press secretaries at the White House are literally in-house reporters. It's our job to sort out information from a often resistant bureaucracy, ferret out what the facts are, find out what the full story is, and then try to articulate that to a always skeptical press corps. But just like reporters, we need to be careful about the sources we use inside our own government. All policy advisors aren't created equal. Many have their own agenda and are trying to push the president in one direction or another, and many, wittingly or unwittingly, use the press secretary to pursue that goal. My job, like a reporter, is to talk to all sides involved in an issue, get a sense of where we really are, and most importantly, where I think the president's going to come down on any given issue. I think just as we don't want CNN repeating bad information on the air, the White House press secretary shouldn't become the unwitting mouthpiece of bad information by blindly relying on one source within the White House. Now, journalists know this. As far as the advice go to them, I think it's the first thing they learn, and obviously it's a rule well worth following. But I think in the echo chamber that is Washington, sometimes they forget it. And I think the advice is simple, that they ought to report stories, confirm rumors, and things they can't confirm, they ought to forget. And I think we went through a very difficult period in 1998 where those basic tenets of journalism were tested very seriously about how well you had to know something before you reported it, and whether you were actually reporting something or just repeating what somebody else had reported. There's one idea that one of my colleagues at the White House had, and I think it actually has some merit. And it has merit both for people who work at the White House and reporters. I think the next administration, when the reporters come in and start fresh, and they get to know a new group of White House staff, and the White House staff gets to know each other and the reporters, they ought to try one thing, which is start out the year by having a few index cards of all the sources you talk to. And every time you call as a reporter a source, or every time in the White House you call one of the other advisors, just jot down, what you asked them about and what information they gave. And I think you'd be surprised about how this simple thing could make reporting much better, because I guarantee you at the end of 6 months, you'll find half your sources don't have the slightest idea what are going on, but are telling you things because it's either where they want things to be, or they're hopelessly out of the loop and they're just trying to prove that they're in the loop. And I think you'd find that you've got a stable of good sources that you can rely on. Second rule, just so you don't think this is going to be too serious. Forget the books you read here about Machiavelli and de Tocqueville. You're better off with Letterman and Leno. I can't overstate this, the most potent weapon in any press secretary's arsenal is a good sense of humor. It is something that should be used and used often. It is the single best way to disarm a hostile press corps. And I think the same goes for reporters. I think reporters as a group are serious. There are times when you can lighten up and they shouldn't take themselves so seriously. Third rule, get out of town. The worst thing a reporter can do is bunker down on the White House campus. Bad guys aren't the only thing the Secret Service is keeping out. The real world is kept at bay too. The same is true of White House staff. Even when we leave the White House and travel around the country or travel around the world, we tend to spend all our times in hotels and filing centers in the same bubble that always envelops the president, talking to the same people. It's important when you get out to take time to talk to people and, more importantly, to listen. Politicians and the press all use polls, and they think it's a silver bullet in trying to understand where the public is, but it really is no substitute for the real thing. And as an aside, you would be very surprised at how often a remark made to either a staffer or to the president becomes policy, because it is so much more real than what we normally traffic in. I think the best reporters find time to get outside the White House, get outside the Beltway, and meet real people. And there's a little test too if the next time there's a debate up here. And it's something that someone pointed out to me, and it's actually quite true. Next time you go to a debate, watch the reporters. When the debate's over, 99% of them are going to run out of the room and go into the room where all of the aides and the pundits are, and they're going to spin each other, and they're going to write a story. And there will be one or two who will stay behind and actually talk to the audience. And they'll find out what people really think. And I think that's something that we can all learn from. Now, 4, this is one personally important to me. Don't believe your own hype. We live in a celebrity culture that unbelievably has extended to people like press secretaries and even journalists who cover the White House. All of us now get what Andy Warhol called 15 minutes of fame. But all of this needs to be kept in some perspective. There are many of us at the White House who are still trying to come to grips, and David will appreciate this, with the concept of the President's National Economic Advisor, Gene Sperling, being labeled Washington's most eligible bachelor. It's not serious, and at times it can get in the way of the jobs. I'll tell you my own personal example. I always, at some point, wanted to have the opportunity to be on the David Letterman show. I just thought it would be a really neat thing to somehow get on that show. My hope, personally, was to be on as a guest and not a prop. But one night I tuned in, and there was Dave holding up my picture saying, and I quote, "How'd you like to be this guy?" Not exactly what I was hoping for on my late night premiere, but so I have it. I think there's an important point here, which is remember why you're here, remember why you came to Washington, remember that it's the policy and the politics that drove you there. I think press secretaries are here to articulate an agenda, not to set an agenda. Reporters here are here to cover the news, not become a story themselves. And I think overall we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously. Rule 5. We're getting through these, don't worry, it's not too many more. Lose a news cycle, it won't kill you. In fact, it might be good for you. This is actually a simple but quite serious point, and it's one that we find in the White House with too often the wrong and the hard way. But simply put, news deadlines and the constraints that they impose can make for rotten policy. When you're making decisions about important decisions that affect people's lives, and you make those decisions based on the fact that you've got to make the 6:30 news, you're going in the wrong direction. I think when you're in the battle for the evening news, you often find out you're stuck with a policy that you pay for a long time. I think the same thing goes for reporters, and I think this is hard for people particularly people who write daily, but it's important to understand that it's okay not to know the answer right away. Stories don't have, or most stories I know, don't have perfect construction of beginning, middle, and end that somehow magically conform to a reporter's deadline. Reporters need to take more time to see how a story develops, resist the urge to push the story to a definitive conclusion just because they have a 9 p.m. deadline. I think one famous editor said, you know, when the history of the world is written, no one will remember whether you had it on Saturday or Sunday, and that's important and should be remembered. 6, avoid what we affectionately at the White House press office call the Smarty pants syndrome. What's that? We all, and I include myself in this group, want to show always that we're the ones who really know what's going on. Whether we're reporters who see every move the president makes as cynical and calculated, or whether it's White House insiders who use every opportunity to demonstrate how cynical and calculated we really are, but all for the purpose of showing how smart we are and how plugged in we are. I think when you've been in Washington too long, you might be shocked by this, but Americans actually want to know what happened in Washington, and they want to, and how events of Washington affects them, not who won, who lost, and why. I think staffers and reporters alike should do a better job of telling the story of what happened and concentrate less on the side issues and many dramas that often consume us. A reporter for a magazine recently wrote in a story that reporters and his colleagues endure substance, but they love staff shakeups. Nothing is better as who's up, who's down, and who's out. But I think both on my side of the aisle, if we did a better job and spent more time actually telling people what happened, and with a little less spin, and if the politicians and even the pundits spent more time reporting, we'd all be better off. 7, admit your mistakes. Easy to say, hard to do. I find that it's one of the hardest things to deal with between politicians and the press, but clearly for me, and my experience shows that nothing takes the wind out of the sails of a sharp question more quickly than just admitting an error, and nothing makes a problem worse and compounds it by failing to admit an error. And I think that works on the other side too. I've had many conversations with reporters where I've taken them to task in an aggressive way for something that I thought was unfair or inaccurate. And I have great respect for those, and it certainly takes the wind out of my attack when they can say, I made a mistake, you're absolutely right. I think we're all human. We all get it wrong sometimes. Admitting mistakes, I think, actually bolsters credibility. And I think the credibility of reporters would go up, too, if they didn't hesitate as much as they do to admit that sometimes they get it wrong. Number 8, when it comes to having a complex plan for solving the world, always have 10 points. Number 9, see point 8. Number 10, keep it short. I know that may sound a little rich for someone who from time to time helps with President Clinton's speeches. But believe me, at one point the State of the Union did have a halftime show. Let me finish by saying, remember, you're only as good as your last sound bites, so I'll wrap up. I want to thank you all for listening, clearly more patiently and respectfully than my normal audience. I'm delighted to take questions tonight, and more delighted than I normally am to take questions. So thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take questions as our normal pattern from the floor down here, and then there are 2 microphones on the top. Let me ask you a question, if I might, to begin, Joe. Many White Houses in the past have found that the press secretary sometimes faces a dilemma, and that is the dilemma of feeling that he or she has 2 bosses. One is the responsibility to tell the American people the truth, and the other is the responsibility to protect the president. You've seen that dilemma yourself, as have many of your predecessors. How does a press secretary resolve it?
Yeah, it's one of the great parts of this job that the only thing that really makes me nervous is when somebody's happy with me. And let me explain what I mean by that. I actually do feel most days like I have 2 bosses. The press corps, I serve at their mercy, and without their respect, I would be useless. But I also work for the president, believe very strongly in what he does. And that works across purposes. And when someone's happy with me, when someone's very happy with me, someone's very unhappy with me. And that balance never gets broken. But I think there is a direct answer to David's question, which is I do work for the president. I do believe in what he does. But I also believe very strongly and am committed to the idea that the press has the right to know and should have access to what the government's doing. I grew up in a family of journalists, so I believe very strongly in that. So I think ultimately, your true master is the truth. The one red line you never cross is crossing the truth. And I think, as I mentioned in my speech, there's all sorts of temptation, and the system is stacked and built to try to get you to shave the truth and sort of put some, extra spin on things. But I think if you remember that that's your ultimate master, you're able to navigate between what is oftentimes a quite interesting cross-current.
Hi, I'm Nikki Usher. I'm an undergraduate at the college. I was just curious if you came out and told the press at a press secretary meeting that, just the plain truth without the spin, do you think they'd be able to tell?
God, I hope not. Listen, I think 95% of what I do during the day has nothing to do with standing at the podium and doing the briefing. So I think most people who just watch in that sense get a very distorted view. And I think having said that, most of my conversations are very factual and don't really involve trying to move a reporter one way or the other. It's just trying to provide information that I have access to that they may not because of my position within the government. I think the briefing has evolved because of the introduction of cameras into a kind of session of political theater. So it's really not what it seems on most days. It's really not, most of the questions that get asked of me at 1 o'clock have been asked of me at 9:30 in a meeting in my office with reporters. So it's really an exercise we go through to provide pictures for television and has lost some of the meaningful exchange. That doesn't mean we've lost contact with the press. We do it in a number of other ways. So I think while we do, and I do engage in trying to put things in the best light possible, and I'm always conscious of anything I say being taken and dissected into 4-second sound bites. I wouldn't look too much at the briefing, and I don't think the reporters see it as, you know, an essential part of news gathering, just one part, but particularly for the broadcast journalists.
Yes, I'm Jesse Stellato, a freshman also at the college. And I'm interested as one of the probably the biggest or most important messengers. How do you react personally to the kill the messenger mentality? How do you deal with it every single day?
Oh, first is not taking all that seriously, and more importantly, not taking it personally. I mean, I understand that one of my jobs is to deflect a lot of questions, answer a lot of questions, because the president can't spend all day doing what I do. He's got other responsibilities. So, you know, I don't. I think the overriding thing here is that every once in a while you do get in trouble when, you know, someone's critical of you, or, you know, an attack comes at you, and you do take it seriously, and you kind of take it personally. But most days, it's, you know, it's part of the game, part of the theater that we go through, and, you know, it's quite easy to laugh off. That's with some exceptions.
Glad you can do that.
Going where?
Hi, my name is Sheila Memoron. I'm not a student at Harvard, but I had an unusual experience to be a student of politics in Europe during impeachment and Kosovo, and I had the ability to turn on the news when I wanted to watch it, and I was very disappointed by the way the American news came across in that part of the world. It was being played as more ethnocentristic propaganda. And even as an American politics student who loves this country, it just didn't play well. And I wonder, even with an intelligent American public, how you fight that, or whether or not you think about it and what you do.
Well, I mean, I tend to agree that impeachment didn't play well from my own personal experience. I'm searching for something there, but I can't find it. Kosovo, I don't know that I have the same experience as you had. I found Kosovo to be in many ways a lot more challenging from a communications perspective than impeachment was, because impeachment quickly became a political battle, and political battles are not new to Washington. The rules are fairly clear, although we charted some new territory over the year, but it was essentially about politics, and that's pretty straightforward. I think on Kosovo, let me make a couple points. One is that I think clearly there was a difference in the coverage, and I remember a leading member of the House coming down to the White House during the middle of the conflict and saying that they'd just been in Europe, and they were struck by the difference between switching between BBC World Service Television and CNN, and how different the Europeans were covering the conflict and the Americans. But it goes back to why this was such a challenge for us. I think this conflict was the first time in my memory where there was significant dissent from political leaders. There were a number of prominent Republican leaders who did not support the conflict, and more importantly, because I think there's always that, who did not support it publicly. Secondly, there was a kind of sort of skepticism on steroids that I'd never quite seen before in the press about whether the operation would work, on whether the operation had any chance. Now, I'm not talking about day 65 and we're getting nowhere and this isn't going to work. I'm talking about day 2, dealing with stories in the paper, reporting, and all well-sourced from people who I'll never know who they are, saying this has no chance. This is a failed operation in the second day of it. So I think I don't know exactly if our perspectives are the same on this, but this really was a difficult communications challenge because unlike Desert Storm, this was going on in a place where journalists didn't have free access, so there weren't visual images that could either define success or failure. We were relying very much on talking heads like me, and at places at the Pentagon and the State Department, which are frankly a poor substitute. And there was a very aggressive and very sophisticated media operation coming out of Belgrade that, as far as looking at it just in the frame of what their task was, they did their job quite well. So it was a very frustrating and difficult time, but eventually it was successful, and in a very small part, some of the success was just because of some of the work that was done around the government in making sure that we continued to explain to the public what we're doing in an attempt to make sure that the public continued to support what we were doing.
My name is Indira. I'm a graduate student of Boston University. As you said, that perception is reality, and as the Press Secretary of United States of America, you have all the power to create perception not only in Washington or not only in the United States of America, but in the world. And you have all the power to create that reality. From the good side, it can be an educational tool, but from the bad side, it can be a biased perception in the world, not only in the United States of America. What I want to know is, do you tend to use that power of creating perceptions for the sake of President Clinton or for United States of America, or you tend to just tell all the facts without really creating any perceptions at all?
Well, I mean, I think it's impossible to completely separate that. I think in an ideal world, a cold, sterile dissemination of the facts would lead the public to support what the president's agenda is, or support some operation we might have going internationally. But I think the world in which we live, we have to create, use information and create a positive impression in order to get that done. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing if it's done within limits. This president has a very aggressive agenda. He's got a wide range of issues that are very important to him, and it's very important in the system in which we work, where Congress often gets a say on what we're doing, that we build public support, because Congress listens to the public. So I think we do have a challenge of doing that, and again, I think within reason, that's acceptable and even a positive part of what we do. That also applies, I think, to around the world. I think the U.S. Has interests around the world, and we actively use the communications assets we have to try to pursue those interests. And again, I think all done in the right balance and moderation, that is quite a positive thing, but it's certainly something where we have in the past overstepped, at home and abroad, and it's something we have to watch.
My name is Felicity Spector. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I'm also a journalist with Channel 4 News from Britain. Covering the primary campaign in New Hampshire, I found that the mentality of the war room had sort of pervaded the campaign styles of most of the candidates, in that this whole thing that you talked about of rebuttal, pre-buttal, the speed, which is destroying the trust between politicians and the press, was present there. And you could hardly get to talk to a candidate, except with John McCain, who had this Straight Talk Express, where he just sat, talked to anyone who showed up, foreign press, anybody. Now, do you think this kind of openness, which has generated very positive coverage, could be replicated in the White House, or is it simply something which could really realistically only be present within a campaign?
Well, I think you've hit on some of the things that I've talked about. When it's, I've never actually seen a war room, but I feel what the operations are like. I mean, the office that I worked in when I worked for the president in 1996, next to mine was a young guy who was the director of research, a very talented and gifted person who, on a daily basis, made me look very smart by giving me all sorts of information. And his claim to fame is he used to hand me these things, which he called, as you said, pre-buttals. And his claim to fame was, after that campaign was over, Webster's actually put it in the dictionary, and he somehow felt responsible for creating a new word. But there's something wrong with with that kind of mindset, and I think I tried to touch on it. Now, the one thing that I didn't mention, and I think is positive, is I think all these things are cyclical. Things work as long as they work, and when somebody builds a better mousetrap that works better, the people will gravitate to that, and I think you see it. Although I do have to say that I haven't watched as closely as I might have on the Republican side, but I think it's quite often the strategy of the so-called insurgent campaign, the non-front runner, to provide a lot of access as a way of generating media. Generally what happens in our system is they win New Hampshire and they clam up because they play by the rules, and I think there's certainly some evidence that Senator McCain has not and is pursuing a different strategy. I think everybody watches and everyone's going to do what they think works. It's people ask me, why do you have all these negative attack ads in politics? Because they work. And when will they go away? When they don't work anymore. And I think we're actually watching this campaign at a distance. There's promising signs sprinkled all the way through it. You've got situations where people are being penalized for being negative. You've got situations where access actually is something that works for you. I think anyone who does what I do, want to put candidate with press. And because we believe in our candidate and we think it'll work, but we've all been burned by what happens when there's too much access and you can't control your message. It's a fine balance that goes back and forth. And I think there is some signs out there that the pendulum is swinging back, and I think that's good for all of us. Yeah.
Hi, I'm David Mahalapi, a sophomore at the college, and I was wondering, has your sense of humor ever backfired on you during your time as press secretary?
You mean besides tonight? The answer is yes. I'm trying to think of occasions. They sort of get blotted. Let me try to answer it this way. Sometimes you get sucked into the feeling that you're only talking to the people in the room. This is a nice, cozy setting here. I can look around the room and think, I can tell a joke here that, the people here will get. Well, you forget that TV, technology, it goes around the world in a minute. I find that I made an innocuous statement just before Christmas. But there was a journalist from another country who asked me a question about some religious practice in his country, and I was sort of preaching to convert Southern Baptists. And I gave what I thought was an answer that lasted for about 40 seconds and said absolutely nothing. But somewhere in that answer was something that was very offensive to Southern Baptists. And 2 days later, I had members of Congress calling for me to resign. And I meant no offense, and I apologized because having looked at what I said, it deserved. I had to apologize. It was right for me to. And I think sometimes you do run the risk of, in an attempt to show how smart you are and how funny you can be, having it backfire on it. I'm sure that there are examples, and I'm sure when I get back to the office, my staff will have them stacked up for me. So I will send them to you.
When a flub does occur and misinformation reaches the American public, what do you do? How do you mitigate the misinformation?
It's nothing more complicated than just trying to get out and correct the record. But it's, I think you think of these things as major policy areas where you've made a mistake and you somehow have to go correct it. The reality is most of the time you end up correcting things that are fairly innocuous, but it's important to correct because there is a record. Through the magic of technology, anyone in the world can access any word I've said in the last 2 years in about 30 seconds, if you know how to manipulate a computer. And you just don't want to keep mistakes on the record. I made a mistake last week where I confused 2 meetings. We do a thing where every Friday we tell the reporters what's happening the next week. And I confused 2 events, and I told them that on Thursday we're doing this, this, and this, when it really was the following Tuesday. But I had to start my next briefing by saying, I made a mistake yesterday, to get it in the record. I think some of them are more serious. We had an example in the last couple of weeks with a political issue of the Social Security earnings test. It was, and this was simply an example of, I knew where the president was on A, B, and C, and I assumed on this question, which was D, because I knew on A, B, and C, I knew the answer. I gave the answer. Guess what? I was wrong. He went out and gave his real position, and the reporters came all running back to me saying, well, the president must have flipped because he said you were in a different place. And I said, well, no, the president didn't flip. I was wrong. And it was not the most pleasurable thing to do, but it was a lot better than trying to construct some convoluted explanation about how the president really hadn't flipped his position. And every once in a while, I'm not, I don't know every detailed position of where he is, and if I'm not sure, I should just keep my mouth shut.
We promised we would end by 9:15, so why don't we make this the last question?
Thank you. My name's Lisa Langdon. I'm a junior at Boston College, and if you think these folks are crazy for being here on Wednesday night, it's my 21st birthday tonight.
Is everybody going to sing happy birthday?
That's not what
Just
I
kidding.
intended. I too have a John McCain-inspired question, and I was wondering if you think the focus on truth-telling and straight talk is going to have a positive effect on the media and politics, or if it might have a negative effect on the campaign, if it's going to obscure issues in policy because the voters are focusing on who's going to tell us the least lies instead of who has the best agenda.
It's a good question, which I'm not sure I know the answer to. I think that obviously it's an important question. It's an important criteria as you assess a candidate, whether he should be president. I think you have every right in the world to assess a candidate's character, and those things are certainly not out of bounds. I do think, though, that in the the politics of I'm going to tell you everything that happened today in a minute 30, we have gotten away from what it is that politicians stand for, what it is that they want to do. And this is on both sides. Campaigns have increasingly become, have moved away from, formal positions, long-winded and somewhat boring position papers, and more into sound bites and, campaign events that provide a good visual. And I think it does obscure where candidates really are on issues, what they have in mind, what they're planning to do. And I think that kind of coverage and that kind of campaigning really does sell the public short, because I have found in going around and talking to people, and it's not always the same issue, but everyone has issues, one or two or three things that something that Washington does, it really impacts their life. And it's hard to find. Even when you can get on a computer, you can see, streaming video of every candidate in every possible situation known to man, it's sometimes hard through all of that mess to find out where they actually stand on something. So I think it's a good question. I don't have a solution for how we resolve it, only that until we resolve it, I don't think you're going to find that people are going to come back into the system, that we're going to get voter rates up to over 50%. You're not going to see the kind of you're not going to see a disappearance of the kind of cynicism that I think pervades our political system. And maybe, as I said earlier, the next campaign or the next part of this campaign, somebody will just get up and say, here's who I am, here's what I want to do, figure out whether you can vote for me or not, and if it works, everybody in the world will copy it.
Joe, let me thank you on two counts. First, for taking time out from one of the busiest schedules in Washington. You had a press conference that you had to prepare the president for today. You arrived here an hour before you spoke. You came up basically for this session tonight, and that was most kind of you. More to the point, we'd like to thank you for bringing to us not only your humor and your goodwill, but your candor. And you remind us of what the motto of this great university is, Veritas. Thank you, Joe Lockhart. Thank you and good night.